Welcome to the Bioinformatics CRO podcast. Today I'm joined by Deniz Kavi, co-founder and CEO of Tamarind Bio. Tamarind is building software that helps scientists access computational biology tools at scale through a web platform and API across areas like protein design, structure prediction, and docking. We'll talk about what Deniz is building now, how he got there, and what advice he has for people trying to build at the intersection of biology, software, and AI. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So tell us about Tamarind.
Yeah, Tamarind is, as you described, basically an aggregator of all the leading molecular design tools, so things like AlphaFold and RF diffusion and many others. We provide in a single place for all scientists to use, basically. So we try to do the work like the boring, annoying, undifferentiated work is what we try to do our best in. So scaling up these tools, applying them to real problems, connecting them into multiple stage pipelines, so on. I got into this problem basically doing this as a human for my colleagues at Stanford. So in my undergrad lab, my job was to get an email, run AlphaFold 10,000 times, email it back to one of my colleagues. And at some point, I felt there does not need to be a person doing this. You can just have a software solution from there. So basically trying to lower the accessibility gap, but also handling the infrastructure, the software aspect of how you deploy computational tools like molecular design models.
What are you most excited to build or learn about right now?
Yeah, I think today we spending a lot of time on developer tooling to some extent. I think we found that we work mostly with large pharma and biotech companies, and we found that these organizations have a lot of interest in how they do have their R&D teams deploy AI to their use cases, and ultimately we sort of serve that demographic, and we are building a lot of tooling for that. So I think what's most exciting to me right now is a organization-wide, 1 to 10,000 person deployment of molecular AI tools for serious drug discovery applications, things that will go to clinical trials or become tool proteins, what have you. Yeah, I think serving data scientists and AI folks who then deploy that to the whole organization, something I'm very excited about today.
What problem do you most want to solve for scientists?
I think the general genesis of the company has this theme of accessibility. Historically, if you look at how software has worked in our industry, you do a computational chemistry PhD, you take a 4-month course on this one software product, and you become an expert on it, and then you're the person tasked with running all these workflows for your colleagues. I think we think there's a spectacular amount of inefficiency in sort of the handoff in information or in convincing your computational colleague to do this work for you, like all the lobbying internal work. I think our general case is that because of the increased capabilities of AI recently, it'll be available for every scientist and not just specialists in 20, 30-person data science teams, but the entire org will be the consumer answer of people applying the AI tools in our day-to-day. So I think very much having every scientist be empowered by computational tools as opposed to a realm of specialists doing it for them.
What's the backstory on the name?
Yeah, unfortunately not a very exciting story, but we basically wanted it to be named after a living thing. We went through a list of trees, found tamarind as a memorable fruit and a notable name, and then went from there.
Got it. Where do you think the real bottleneck sits today? Is it model capabilities, infrastructure, workflow design, adoption, something else?
Yeah, I guess I would be biased to say infrastructure. I think model capability is a credible thing to look at as well. I think the better the individual tools are, the less uncertainty you have, the more reliability you have on the individual models, the sort of more valuable the infrastructure becomes. Because if you have to tweak a bunch of knobs and find all the errors and evaluate against them, the model itself may not be very useful if you don't know those exact details. But in our case, we're seeing the molecular design tools especially become good enough in the space that you can just point at a problem and apply it there and go from there, basically. Our general view would be having it be available to a scientist. I'm repeating myself over and over. So general, very much the sort of focus of the company is how do you get somebody with an interesting idea for a target or a drug program or a way to optimize a lead protein or a lead sequence, and how do you get them to convert that idea into a molecule on the computer, basically. I think broadly the issue is not so much the hypothesis generation or having targets to go after. It's more so how do you, once you have a problem to solve, how do you apply tooling to solve that problem? It's how we think about one of the gnarliest problems in the space.
What does great software for life scientists look like for you?
Yeah, I think we, from the start, focused on having an opinionated way to apply these tools in the first place. If you take a look at the papers of these, there are a lot of focused on how the model is trained, how the inputs should look. Our view has always been basically we built a sort of opinionated, structured way to consume those tools in a serious drug discovery use case. So for structure prediction, complexes and docking is a big use case. For protein design, a lot of papers come out and say we are creating a way to create new structures, and these are arbitrary, these are not becoming drugs, these are not becoming antibodies or vaccines or what have you, and we build templates and recipes to make that work more effectively. That's one avenue, is you need to codify and build the best practices into your product. The other side is, I think, integration. So we have been very, like, the entire product from day one has been usable programmatically. So our API or MCP or agent offering is basically a way for any arbitrary code to call our product. So I think in a way we can just go away in the background, just be done as infrastructure, and that just gives you flexibility to consume the tooling in wherever you want it. So it might be in your ELN, your LIM system, in your internal custom applications, or your AI agents within Claude, what have you. I think those two are the main points. You want to build a opinionated, codified way, like a very practical focused applications of the AI tools, and the other side is the how do you get a scientist to use you where they want you to use them. That's the two pillars, I would say.
What part of the scientist experience do people outside the field most often miss?
I think amount of uncertainty in everything you do, basically. Like I think some people think about the process as I have an idea, I will do an experiment to fail or not fail that idea, and then that'll be the end of it. And if it works, it's going to be a drug and it's going to clinical trials. If it doesn't work, I like toss it. But oftentimes there's uncertainty in the actual experiments you do and the computational tools you use. Is anything you do has some error bars associated with it, and you have to believe and persist every time something is like going wrong, where it might be a sign of it being interesting. Very rarely something inside is immediately a useful result, or like you even get data that like proves it in either direction. So I think that's a very much something people not think about is you're not really sure where you're going when you're in the middle of a process or like hypothesis in general.
What have conversations with users taught you that theory never would have?
I think we don't talk much about people talk a lot about like where AI is interesting, where the applications are, but applications like are pretty broadly on what people think about as things that computers can do. I think if you think about the grand idea of a virtual cell, the sort of, I guess, philosophical leaning of a research work there would be you want to create a thing that simulates the entire behavior of a cell in the computer. But realistically, that is like too big of a problem to be applied immediately today. So in some ways, I have a computer science background. I have a sort of a basic science background in relevance to that as well. But I'd never worked in a sort of specific R&D org before in a drug discovery context. And I have learned a lot about what the day-to-day problems are in the context of a research program for a drug program, what the use cases there are. So that's things around assays are most interesting, what sort of you can trust on, what you can trust, what the sort of clinical risks are before going into the later stages. I think that type of day-to-day experience is very hard to see. Certainly in academia, even if you're a very strong scientist, you might not know the sort of how the applications go. And there is a meaningful difference in academic science and commercial drug discovery focused science, I would say. And having not worked in that space, I get the privilege of talking to like pretty senior folks who manage these R&D programs and learning how they think about those use cases is very valuable for me.
How do you decide what to hide behind the interface and what scientists should still control directly?
That's always a changing structure for us for the most part. I would say people tell us that this point is a big value add for the first one. Like we have whatever tens of thousands of scientists. People will email us when they want a model added. I think we've always had a question of complexity versus abstraction, where we have say a few hundred person org in a company using us, and also like some 30, 50 person data science team using us. And the interests of those groups are not necessarily the same. The scientist wants it to be easy to use. I can come in, use it, and then forget about it. But the data scientist might be, I want to get every single possible option. Generally, we've built our product in two distinct ways. So the API, for example, is you do anything you want programmatically. You can write code to build on top of our product, and then nowadays the API actually serves as a way to like abstract even further. So we found AI agents as a good way to guide the user to most of our value from AI agents, like not even necessarily the reasoning, but just the hiding the complexity of how you consume a tool. That's the one avenue. And the web interface is also there for the most complex way to basically anything you need for a given tool you can use within the web interface. So we bifurcated our products in that way for different cases. And then generally just being close to the customer. And people tell us when they're unhappy, and it's a boring answer, but just you be very close to your check-ins and regular meetings, what have you, where people will tell you what problems they have and how whether or not we're able to solve them, or if we can solve them, are they able to access that problem or access that solution to that problem, are the main ways.
What does a trustworthy AI assisted workflow look like to you?
Yeah, I think generally I guess these are two different answers for what we live in the molecular domain and also the sort of general knowledge work, reasoning, LLM tasks. I would say on the molecular side, if you just want wet lab data, I think we've seen a big explosion of the recent models doing very well in sort of classical one binder design or structure prediction problems. And much of that was launched by you can do an experiment to see that this model works and like you can see the hit rates, what have you. I think that both added a lot of trust, but also, despite not substantial changes in architecture, showed just that the models can be good and you can demonstrate that they're good in that way. I think there's still some questions there, like how much you can see from experiments. That obviously you can't run a clinical trial to show that your model works every time. On the molecular design side, I would say you just want to run an experiment that can be as close to the use case as possible. And then surprisingly enough, like most of the best performing models like don't really tend to correlate with a direct experiment. Like most of them are not simulations of an assay you would do. Many of them are, but not probably the most successful aren't. But that's one. For LLMs, I think the main question is around, to some extent, the tools LLMs have access to are not particularly strong. I think if you give the tools a bioinformatician uses to an LLM, there's still some uncertainty and problems around that because of the sort of either inaccuracy of the specific tools you're using or the value of the reliability and the accuracy of the tools it's using in the first place. If you give an LLM a protein design model, you now have two things to worry about, which is a faulty tool using another faulty tool, and you have to make sure that you have to find out which one's the wrong part there. Our view for that has been basically being very transparent and clear about what the tools it's using are looking like and evaluating those results. Our LLM agents basically call our same, like whatever humans would use, the LLM uses that tool, and you can interpret it in the same way. So all sort of the abstractions we built help there. The other questions are how good is the LLM in scientific parsing and understanding what's going on. I think at this moment in time, the Claude up was Claude 4.6, and as of recording, is a 5.4 thinking for GPT are reasonably good at not hallucinating anymore. I think questions tend to be where do you take the result of a paper at face value, like what the result you're citing at face value versus is it applicable. So let's say if a model setting to use a tool, the only tool it has access to for, let's say, protein solubility prediction, it just says protein solubility predictor, and it does not have any error bars or caveats or any details there. The model has no choice but to, I have this is the one thing I have, let me just call this and give it to my user. But in fact, maybe refusing to do something or showing its limits is probably a more valuable thing there. Somewhat long-winded answer, but I should say declaring and showing uncertainty and then maybe rejecting tasks when it's not confident in its ability to do them are two major points, I would say. And so I think the RLHF efforts on the LLMs are doing this well for other medical advice or what have you. I think these will apply for science because we're not trying to adversarially convince a model to do something that's bad because there's no benefit to having it do a ineffective in silico experiment, I should say.
How do you think about simplicity without flattening the science?
Yeah, definitely a difficult problem. I would say the honest answer is like education and support is the honest best way to go about this. I think we try not to limit capabilities of the tools we serve. To some extent, we do. Honestly, like for the say small molecule design tools, for example, like so many custom options you could be doing that it becomes untenable to use them for anything in the first place. So we try to build recipes of most commonly used use cases. I think the sort of open-ended AI models, like things like protein design or small molecule discovery, or even the LLMs themselves, they have a lot of use cases that can be discretized into buckets of this is my one use case. I want to do docking prediction for small molecules. And I have a big world model that does it for me. I think narrowing those down to different tasks is a church approach people take. I think it's just like unfortunate because if you can have a single model do everything, it's quite a more interesting experience and more interesting results most likely. But for the most part, it's carving out chunks of the capabilities and like giving them as recipes. You can use one approach, so you don't really lose the capability there. You just become a bit more constrained into a way of doing things, which can be good if the model is not that good, not that performant is the other detail there. So for the most part, I think focusing on where the models are good, and like you can know that by being close to your customers, but also being close to the results in the first place and doing a sheer review, and then carving out those places to be individual tasks you're looking at are the things we try to do.
What things are easiest to overbuild in this space?
I think you can make a lot of analogies to like horizontal software players. So I think in some ways you resemble something like a Databricks or Snowflake quite a bit. We do model inference, training, onboarding your custom tools, app builders. Most of those hold, but those products are also used in the life science industry and they can't quite apply to them directly. I think the over-index on verticalized solutions for the industry. You think of yourself as a very bespoke product. There's lawyers who do life sciences, there's procurement teams who do life sciences, and in fact, some of that might just be if you just take the horizontal version like up and modify and optimize that might be a decent way to approach it in the first place. You don't need to reinvent everything. You can probably use the workflow builder, the pipeline builder for generalized use cases probably works well for the bioinformatics use cases as well. I think we don't need to overindulge in our specialness and difference from the software industry or whatever the AI applications are. I think that's the one thing I see a lot of is you want to reinvent tool hosting and say that bioinformatics is basically computer science, and then a lot of the tools there you can apply to the general use cases. So I think we, both from people who gets into the industry perspective, like we hire a lot of non-biotech folks on the software side, and then also what tools we use to build products they don't all need to be from scratch. They can be building on the horizontal solutions.
When new tools or models appear, what makes you pay attention?
Yeah, I think surprisingly enough, I think to some extent, like the social media hive mind is like a decent predictor, like how much interest there is in something. That doesn't necessarily mean it's like the most accurate or the most interesting. Like some of our models are probably very well known. People outside the industry know them, what have you, but they're like basically not used. I think some level of interest tends to be a sign of value. I think if something just goes out to bioarchive and nobody talks about it, like it doesn't tend to be the most valuable. I think that like in that case, like the most obvious thing is immediately valuable. The other side is these days, lab validation you can discretize and show for, especially in our use cases, in the molecular design use cases. I think if you show clear objective results there, I think we're doing a decent job of putting out benchmarks. There's more to be done there for sure as well, like for other use cases. In my mind, it's basically two avenues. One is it can do something that was never doable before. I can make a fully a protein completely from scratch and put it out and express in the real world. That's meaningful scientific results. The other is it does something that was theoretically doable, but it was so much better than that, say 100 times better than that, that it can reliably get there. So again, going back to the protein design example, you've had a renaissance of binder design tools recently, and those are mostly because they've had 100 times the hit rate of the previous generation of tools, and now people can actually use them. And instead of, they don't need to have a huge piece display set up where they spend $1 million on the assay, they can just spend whatever $10,000 and show the results there. So I think it's either increased accuracy, and then the other side is just a net new use cases like invented by this protocol.
What trade offs do you face between frontier capability and everyday reliability?
I think you don't want to be over ambitious in applying tools to a given use case. Theoretically, there's a model that claims to do everything you need to be doing for a drug discovery program. If you read the Wikipedia or you said the GitHub repo, the definitions, and you just did them, you say you gave them to an LLM agent and then told them, don't question these can do exactly what they claim to be doing. And then probably like it will fail in the first step, but it'll fail in the second step and the third step successively. I think there's the incentive is always to publish like a decent result. You just claim maybe the most humble people say towards this task or towards immunogenicity prediction on the computer. You do need to build a muscle of identifying what is there to publish a paper or what is there to show or what shows an interesting result. I think that's one question we have. Is like something that might be at the frontier might not be good enough for it to be actually practically useful. GPT-2 was on the frontier for a while and it was basically useless for a lot of tasks. And similar things apply for our world, which is basically the incentive is to provide the most audacious result you can. But even that might be true in relative terms. It might be 100 times better than the previous stage, but that might not be enough from if it never worked, then it's 0 0. So just making sure that the individual applications are I think restraints are, I should say in that note, restraints are a big thing we think a lot about. Where can a model be applied? What the actual sort of error bars around the results are? And how can we codify that into a product where you can understand what the limitations might be? I think it's just that there's a lot of things that claim to be the best, and then the best is not good enough for a lot of use cases too.
What do outsiders misunderstand about making advanced computational biology tools genuinely usable?
I think the view or the understanding is basically that everybody's aware of what the protocols they want to use are, and like what the best hit rates are. What the people think about computational modeling tools as the same as they would think about like assays, where there's some clearly defined set of worlds. You can buy a recipe or have a recipe built internally and just apply that, and like it's 90% of the time it's going to be the same thing. It's there's some modifications you have to make, what have you. I think both the world is changing so quickly that like very few scientists are actually on top of what's the frontier. I think like we do that role informally by just giving guidance on that and providing educational materials there. For the most part, yeah, the limitations are just people don't really know what works as a community basically. So like I think it's very much in flux, and that might maybe be stabilized like every couple of weeks and then we go off the rails again. The question basically is, do scientists know what they want to do? Do scientists know what works well? And the criticism of the science community is a sort of general observation that the world is moving too quickly and the incentives are such that everybody claims state of the art for everything, and it's hard to be on top of what the direct applications are.
What first pulled you toward the overlap of software and biology?
Yeah, so coming into Stanford, I had done some work for doing natural language processing work. I very wrongly predicted that sort of transformers would not be a good application for life sciences. And so I was doing all the text translation and summarization, sentiment analysis type work. And I just assumed, oh, these are not going to be useful tasks. And I'm going to look at another application. And I got into biology from trying to find cool applications of AI tools as I was going into computer science degree. And basically, in reaction to that, I got a job in a drug discovery context at a lab at Stanford. Yeah, I think it was very much, I was trying to find an interesting application for computer science, which have led me to biology. I've heard this from a lot of mathematicians as well, where the modeling of a complex system tends to be an interesting problem as a mathematician. You become a bio-focused mathematician or what have you.
Was there an early moment when you saw a gap between what scientists needed and what the tooling actually allowed?
Yeah, I think the most obvious for me personally, the earliest sign was basically that I was hired for a full-time job doing this for my lab mates. Somebody, I think to this day we see a lot of this as well, where even large pharma, again, a director of data science at a big pharma company has 15 years of experience. Maybe half their job is, somebody sends them an email and says, "Can you run this in silico workflow for me?" And then they do it for them, but it like takes a few weeks, what have you. I was basically doing that for my job. So we had a protocol for finding targets for peptide candidates in silico way, and that was interesting for applications of my lab, and that sort of led to some other separate work. That was a cell systems publication, and that was out there in the world for people to use, and then nobody in the world could use it. Basically, they would have to have me do it for them, and that was the genesis of the company in general, was just solving that problem of, I have an idea to apply this, but I have no idea how to actually use the tool to apply them to a real use case, and that's how the company came to be too.
What did being close to research environments teach you about how science really gets done?
I think there's just, for the most part, being close to scientists makes you appreciate how valuable their work is, like how hard they're working for these use cases. But the other side is, I guess I'll going back to my previous point, like a lot of uncertainty around how well do you think your idea will work. The experiment you do might fail, the computational tool you use might fail, there might be some side effect you've never known about, and that's sort of, you have to embrace that as a researcher. And I think researchers also think about the world in this way. I think that's more importantly than typical day-to-day experience is, there's a very strong skepticism of everything that comes their way, like anything that could be interesting or useful. People are, just by training of the job, I think, very much skeptical and often negative on these things, which I think is an interesting habit to have. I think it has its pros and cons. I think the temperamental approach is like what the temperament of a scientist is, or life sciences, I should say, is for what the future holds quite interesting, where they simultaneously have a job that is very much, I'm in the frontier, I'm trying to invent the next thing, but also I am also very skeptical and generally negative on everything that might be interesting. And you have to use these ways to do the process of science, basically, which I thought was quite interesting.
What made the founder path feel right for you?
Yeah, I think in our case, we built the first version of Tamarind for my lab as like a side project with my co-founder, basically, and gave it to my colleagues. And then I posted on some random forum about, we have this use case, use AlphaFold on the web, and that led to several hundred users. So there was a lot of demand from academic users who like felt this problem of how they do computational tooling, and that sort of felt strong enough as a pool of interest from users that we felt we should do this full time and not spend our time doing this as a side project in school. And I think that was the primary reason. For the most part, in my mind, I've always not really thought about being, like, I was always wanted to be a scientist or a researcher. And the approach in my mind was, what is most valuable to the world right now of the things I could be doing? What is the fastest path I could get there? And I also was very much pulled towards this idea of, I can move faster in a quicker way than typical timelines. You take, instead of doing a 4-year undergrad and a PhD and another and many years of working in a biotech company, I now get to basically do the job of a executive at a relatively serious biosoftware company, and just by having the virtue of having built this thing as opposed to getting approval from everybody else on top of me. Those are primary motivations. So some combination of, we had a thing that was working that we wanted to make it more serious. The waiting and the having to play the games of getting accredited and approved and going better and better over time by some other institution was not very appealing to me. And the other side was basically for us to realize this idea of how we get these tools to be used by scientists more effectively and at more practical use cases. It has to be a company as opposed to a nonprofit or academic research project, because the incentives are not strong enough for those use cases or for those methods of applying this problem, that we have to make it a company, basically.
How did you learn to tell the difference between an interesting technical problem and an important user problem?
Yeah, I think I always was somewhat commercially minded. which I didn't realize at the time, but I'm basically a salesperson now, so I'm more aware of it today. I think many interesting technical problems can be commercial or user problems as well. The question is, you've been asking for people to pay us from day one, basically, as the one side. I think if you keep it as a free tool that everybody can use, you have too many nice to have type problems. I think you want a investment from the user of their time or their money or their feedback, what have you, where their problem has to be severe enough in their day that they would take some risk, basically, is how we think about that. I think I have a decent way to emulate that in my head today. I can understand what the workflow looks like from just talking to somebody about their day to day. But for the most part, we do inference scaling for AI models. So the condition for that to be useful for users is that the AI models are useful for them, and we have to validate that for that use case. Generally, my finding was if you are willing to put something of yourself on the table or risk something of yourself or time or money, what have you, is the main beneficiary of user solutions. And technical products are often, I think engineers are very much drawn to this case. So I think it's interesting. It's a thing to solve, but there's no real thought about what it means to solve a problem as opposed to research curiosity. Yeah, that's my general approach. Getting commitment from the user is the main thing to look at.
What surprised you most about turning research driven insight into a company?
I think I was broadly surprised by how disconnected academia is to some extent from industry. Like, theoretically, all the IP from these companies, all the biotech comes from industry. It gets spun out of labs, it's the professor's research, what have you. But in many ways, also, there are dedicated industry research conferences. The problems you tackle are quite different. Yeah, I think a lot of the basic science is sort of, obviously there's some actual practical R&D work also happening in academic settings. I think very much the context was biotech and pharma think about the world in a series of drug programs or like potential assets you can acquire versus research will be more platform style. You want to get I want to make the machine that makes drugs as opposed to I just want to make a drug and create a company around that or provide a way to create that drug in the first place. Generally, I would say industry is much more open to investing resources to make things more convenient and efficient versus academia or research in general can be, I will have an undergrad do this for 5-10 years and just keep going through and churning through them. I think there's a lot of benefits to some problems that can just be like thoughtfully thought about and then ground through for many years or many long amounts of time. But that also means the timeline for everything you do in academia is very much shortened by what you can do. Like academia or research in general can be immediately a source of commercialization, but if you approach the world from a perspective like I am doing something that's very hard, it's impossible to do, and I'm just like seeing how close to impossible I can get, that sort of somewhat grounds you in your ability to do interesting, so groundbreaking work in some way, versus if you think the thing you're doing is very hard, but it's like possible and like you have a timeline for that. I think projects that are set up in a way where it's going to be, I'm going to do this in the next 2 years versus I'm going to do this however long it takes, tends to be interesting dichotomy there.
Where did you underestimate the human side of the job?
I think for the most part for us it was adoption. So there's one, even once you like close a contract or a customer signs up, like you use it within their organization, there needs to be a deployment process. You need to basically lobby and convince functional heads to get their teams to use us more than I think we have a more rational sales process than most other industries do. Like we don't do these steak dinners or whatever. Like it's mostly a case of proving product value and scientific interest and value there, and getting people to trust you and be the source of expertise, I think pays a lot of dividends, and that is to some extent bounded by knowledge, but also the case is you want to be writing a lot, talking to people a lot, and that tends to be the way you become a brand or a known entity in both attracting talent or customers or what have you, is very much driven by these human social problems. And then I would say in the deployment side, it's very much driven by like political problems, like how you get a team to adopt you and how do you get a larger team to adopt you and how do you get them to use more or pay more and what have you, are ideally you're convincing that you're spending more on Tamarind is a sign of getting better science, but also more adoption means more people have access to these tools that are more practically useful for their day to day. I think I'd never really done any of these tasks. I think I've become a salesperson, as I mentioned, and learning that on the job was very exciting.
Looking back, what moments feel like the real turning points?
I think so the company's about 2.5 years old today, or 2 years and a few months. And the first year, we basically didn't really know what we wanted to build. We had this idea of a web interface for all the models, and you can use them easily. But the models weren't good enough yet. You weren't sure about what the applications would look like. Is the use case productionization? Is it experimentation? Is it like proteins or small molecules? Or how much of the scale part matter? And we had to invent that with our customers. And that was a pretty meaningful thing for us to go through over time. In that sense, to like invent a category basically was their most surprising experience for us was to figure that out. And unlike if you're starting a CRM company or like a pretty typical software company, you can just check what's happening in the world and you can do it again but better. In our case, it was very much a case of how does this product happen ever and how does it become actually applied. I think for the most part, there's been a lot of efforts in this direction, but none of them have gotten that much actual usage. So we've had to invent what the shape of that product would be.
What skills compound fastest at the biology software interface?
I think I would put just like being an information sponge as a very valuable skill to have. I think people underappreciate how much if you just know a lot about the use case you're interested in, if you know a lot about the customer, you get to or just what the product you're building is. Oftentimes, again, the world is changing very quickly. You want to be on top of everything. My view has always been I'm going to spend all the time I have in the world passively learning what I can and being as close, curious, and interested in people as much as I can be. And this can be whatever social media posts, YouTube lectures, or it should be a scientist you want to talk to. I think a benefit of being in the user serving world is that you get to talk to experts all the time. I think if you're doing a computational science PhD and all you do is like you read papers and you publish them and nothing happens afterwards, talking like having a person that uses them is depending on you is a very strong incentive to learn in general. And the ability to learn is a very powerful thing to have. Putting yourself in a structural position where you can learn a lot is quite valuable. The PhD, obviously, like you'll learn a lot there, but the things you learn are very much how do I advance my general PhD research theme versus people are relying on me that are quite important in their organizations. What can I do to solve their problems or another avenue on the learning side?
What's worth learning deeply even though the tools keep changing?
I think honestly, one of the biggest gaps we have is like a very strong core AI folks. I think that you can see the incentives here. Where, like if you're a really good AI person, why would you want to work in biology? Basically, like you can do the core foundation model research, you can do some interesting robotics work or the computer vision, what have you. You'll probably be paid more. There's a couple companies I think like bucking this trend. There's a few like good research organizations, but I think the core foundational computational skills are quite important to learn right now. And there's a world of these get replaced by the old LLM coding agents, but I think having that technical fluency is quite valuable in that I think many bioinformaticians have become basically people in the interface of software and biotech is they become masters of none, and that is not a great place to be for most. So you're being hired for a specific skill, or starting a company for a specific skill, and if you're okay at everything, you might be like decent cog in a machine, and you might just be helpful in an organization, but you're probably not going to move the frontier of that field forward very much beyond that. I think founders become a lot of generalists. I think you do need to be a generalist. I fundraise and sell, and also write papers about like our benchmarking results, what have you, and to some extent being an expert in something that is core computer science and then applying that to life science problems can be a very valuable way to approach this.
How should early career people think about breadth versus specialization?
I think my general concern about breadth, especially in our field, is that you are putting together a lot of things where I've taken some classes at Stanford that were basically surveys of the field because you like want to simultaneously appeal to computer science folks, you want to get into bioinformatics, you want to apply the computational scientists to learn about more computer science. And those courses are like useful, but they also become basically surveys or like very high level walkthroughs of the field, and then those don't tend to create a thoughtful scientist in and of themselves. I think my view in the world in general, like not even beyond this field, is that you want to be an expert in something, and if you are an expert in one thing, you can then become an expert in another thing and go from there, as opposed to trying to do those things simultaneously. To some extent, I have some concerns about I have skepticism about interdisciplinary degrees, for example, in that direction, or like classes or majors that purport to be doing these two things simultaneously. Because if you're trying to learn two things at a time and then combine them together, the degree program like makes a theme or makes up a way to connect those together, but not necessarily a way to actually be a good credentialed expert for that use case. My view would basically be become the smartest person you can be for one field. I would probably start with computer science, honestly, and then see where you can apply the science from there, is my general view.
How can people get close to real scientific pain points instead of building in the abstract?
I think honestly, talk to people or put yourself in a place where you have to do it. I think in some ways, one of the best ways to learn about the economics of a therapeutics company might be to start a therapeutics company. I don't know that I would recommend doing that for everybody, just to learn about that stuff. But I think I really believe in the power of being forced by your environment to do something hard and learning those things on the fly. I think if you're reading papers about how the drug discovery this process is done, like it's just hard to be in that mindset. Like it's even hard to motivate yourself to read those things, right? Because like it's not going to be immediately useful to you. So they put yourself in an uncomfortable situation. I guess in the like general case, I have friends who applied for jobs in places that they were definitely not qualified to do, and they offered you a service for free for them. And if somebody responded, they had to make that work in the next 1 or 2 weeks, and they responded in that way. I think put yourself in an uncomfortable spot that like forces you to learn something, and like that might be a bit embarrassing also if you fail. Is how I think about those things.
How should scientists decide among various career paths?
I think it's a question of, in my mind, I optimize on what I think is going to be most impactful. Because most people has the most meaningful scientific sort of core that grows into something else is how I think about that. Part of the reason I became a founder was very much in this context of if I do the research route, I might be a good scientist like 5 or 10 years from now, but if I'm the median scientist, I'm not going to be very important to the whole of science. And I'll have a lot of papers that have 20 citations. I don't really go that far. That was what I was concerned about personally. You can be a great scientist. I think academic research or general research focus is very important, and some people will do very powerful, impactful jobs there, work there, I should say. My view has always been, what are you optimizing for in life? In my mind, that was impact. So however many people I can impact, I would like to optimize for that, was how I thought about that. So if your belief is that the science of the next generation of, say, virtual cells will be in academia, you should go all into that and then become a PhD and a professor in doing virtual cell work. If you think it's going to be applying some AI tools to therapeutics work, you can start a biotech company or start your own company to some extent. Or the other side might be, I think the most important bottleneck is clinical trials. Even though I have this life science background, let me go try to find out what the clinical trials can be solved with. Yeah, I think so. Find the thing to optimize that you think is most valuable and go for that.
What mistakes do smart, ambitious people make when they enter this space?
I think hmm, I think the mistakes smart people make are always almost the same and independent of the field. I think oftentimes the questions are, you try to learn from somebody else, become a clone of what you think is a good thing to be doing. I think for the most part, it's like a decent way to live your life is to copy someone who is better than you in pretty close proximity to you. I think that's reasonable, but to some extent, you do want to take a leap at some point. You do want to take a risk as much as possible. And that doesn't necessarily have to be like dropping out of school and starting a company, but it can also be something like going beyond replicating somebody else's work, I should say. I think we set ourselves like heroes and people to admire and work to replicate and to be similar to, but that gets you only so far in what you can accomplish. It's helpful to have knowledge of history and what things happened before, but you probably don't want to be living in the shadow of somebody else or someone else's work as much as you would in a typical context.
What habits help you stay grounded when the hype cycle gets loud?
I think I just might say talking to customers again. I think sometimes people will tell me their negative results. So I think it's quite good. There's a lot of X accounts who just talk about how biology will be solved next week. And like I am quite like I think I'm very much exposed to that technology world when I'm quite excited by the technology in the first place. But once you know what's happening in a field, it becomes much less exciting for the most part. I suspect people who do the core AI research for LLMs are probably much more conservative than the people making products on top of them. They're probably both very excited and ambitious right now. I think rightfully, yeah. I think keeping yourself in a place where people whose job it is not to sell AI for their company, but people whose job it is to apply it to their use case. So for AI specifically, but also can go for most everything else is when you open the newspaper, you see the headlines about science and you think they're all bad, and you read all the headlines about politics and you think they're all credible. I think it's one of these things where you just want to be close to the source as much as possible if you care about the results from a given category.
What question do you wish more people asked you?
I think a lot about why there have not been great software companies in the life sciences over the, say, past 50, 20, 30 years. I guess to answer that, I think the value of software was somewhat limited. I think most of R&D spend in biopharma goes to development, like it says experiments, headcount, and then like a bunch more of that money goes to clinical trials and all the commercialization efforts for like obvious reasons, just it's much more expensive. And I think a lot about like why we are different in this world where, basically our belief would be AI is sufficiently new that are powerful that compute will be a more meaningful spend on the biotech side. This company can be a whatever $1 billion revenue company in the next 5, 10 years. And I get asked this from like VCs a lot, but not so much by products and practitioners a lot. And I am curious how folks think about the tools they use, like how viable and sustainable the companies themselves will be. Like in many ways, a lot of these companies get bought by private equity, they get merged into some other things. Like the product does not improve over 5, 10 years. And scientists who use these tools don't think too much about what happens. It feels like whatever happens to the company happens to them also, and like they don't really get to control what happens. And I'd be curious about how scientists think about what software tools they use exist as sustainable, long-living companies versus a thing they bought for a year that might disappear next year.
What belief do you hold more strongly now than you did a few years ago?
I think I'm a believer that AI will be valuable in drug discovery. I think like this is a honestly the starting company is a more open-ended question because of the bottlenecks in clinical trials. Like, is AI the right place, or is drug discovery the right problem to apply this, even in the life sciences world? Where and what if you're optimizing clinical trials, you're like shaving 1 year off a clinical trial? I've become very convinced that at the current rate of getting better, the model's improving, we will have net new assets added to every biopharma company's portfolio of assets that will be driving revenue for them. I think like we think a lot about science outcomes like approvals and clinical trials, but I think AI will make more money for pharma companies is on the drug discovery side by making more drugs for you to get to clinical trials and then approvals eventually. And I think this will almost inevitably will happen in the next couple years or very soon, basically. I think the adoption is there, there's interest, but also I think the results will be speaking for themselves very soon.
What about the inverse? What have you changed your mind about in the last few years?
Yeah, I think I am generally actually more averse to science for like goodness sake. I think you do want to think more about what the outcomes will be. Yeah, I think revenue is a core metric when you're trying to make medicine, think about the commercial results. But to some extent, you are serving tooling for an organization. And I have not thought about it. I think about science as an interesting, valuable way to impact humanity, be good for the world, what have you, and I believe that still. But what you do day to day on at your job is basically the same, whatever job you do. Like some or between the roles I can do anyway are very much the same. And you want to pick your battles more carefully in what you apply yourself to. I think I used to think that you want to work in a field that is good for the world necessarily. It has to be strictly a very clear value add. Um, if I went back to my self 3 years ago and just starting a company, I might just tell them think more clearly about: do you want to work in science forever? Do you want to make a bioinformatics software company? To some extent, you don't necessarily want to be making a plan for yourself without knowing the requirements for that plan. So in this case, of the let me rephrase what I was trying to say, which is basically what is the aligning core thing you're motivating your acts by? I mentioned previously you want to pick a job for one singular thing that you're optimizing for, but be more thoughtful about what that thing is and not just what feels or is good or perceived to be good, but from a fuzzy, open-ended sense. And I think there's a lot of value to be added for clinical trials, like a lot more boring, even like payroll or like better health insurance, what have you, that type of thing is still quite valuable. And I would have looked down on those companies beforehand, where I'm now much more agnostic to humanity exists as a singular sort of effort to make the species better, and whatever you there can be quite valuable.
What boring looking skill turns out to matter far more than people think?
I think generally remembering things is quite important. I think like making structures for yourself to remember people's names and where they work and what their use cases are. I think it pays a lot of dividends in getting to know people effectively. If you keep seeing the same person over and over again, you can talk to them more effectively. Yeah, I think taking a lot of time to remember other people and also the specifics of their work or like what they might be related to you is quite valuable. We've seen a lot in hiring where like keeping track of somebody for many months, like just eventually converting them to be part of the team or a customer in our case, or it might just be scientific collaboration or working with a partner on a specific program. I think just being very taking interest in people and being thoughtful about keeping that interest in you, like in a structured way, and maybe just remember from the top of your head, maybe you just write it down for yourself. I think paying attention to the general theme here is like purposely and spending a lot of time paying attention is quite valuable.
What are you still trying to get better at?
Yeah, I think I spent a lot of time living and breathing with scientists, and I still do it most of the time. I think we are, as a company, looking a lot more like how we can get this enterprise level adoption question of a mature company in our space should look like 9-figure revenue per customer. And that means basically everybody at this company uses you and like for a wide variety of core tasks. I want to become a better, I run a 15, 20 person company today. I'm not like a huge organizational thinker. They're all in the same room basically. I want to learn about how our customers think about systems, how they think about the organizations of their large companies, like making those machines function well. Having managed a small number of people so far is a very complex problem, and both from understanding of what product will be built next, I would like to be understanding of how the organization behaves and reacts to those things, but also running my own team more effectively. I think so. I have basically, over the course of the company, I've picked up skills I've never had and that I was quite bad at the start, and I've become pretty good at. I think the next thing I want to be best at is understanding the behaviors and intents of a large organization and building products first and foremost for those organizations, but also apply those learnings to my own.
What would be exciting for you to see happen in this space over the next few years?
I think if we got 50% of the way to what the models claim they're able to do, honestly, it would be very exciting. I think that would be a pretty meaningful proliferation of these models for different use cases. The protein design is reasonably good, but if you got to, I guess, whoever those sort of hype people say on Twitter about these models, if they become real, which I think is like within the bounds of the announcement we get today, would be very exciting. I think ultimately Tamarind is an index on the belief that models will be getting better for molecular design applications. And that's obviously good for me that the models get better, but also for the value of how we can produce more medicines more quickly and more effectively. And then even before that, just producing new medicines, period. So you can have another list item in the list. So I guess beyond the more boring, the models get better. But if they got as good as what some people think they are right now, would be the main thing I'm looking forward to.
Last but not least, what would you like our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I think the general thing is you don't really need permission to do things. You can start a company, you can work on a research project. It doesn't mean that it will be easy. People will be rejecting you very frequently, but being in an environment where you are constantly rejected, being in an environment where you're punching above your weight is a very valuable place to be. I think people go and follow existing tracks a lot in life, which is very comfortable. It's not pleasant, but what you're supposed to be doing. I think you can go above your station, and if you can hold yourself long enough there, you probably will ascend to a larger point. I am a not very long career. I did this out of school, and I started a pretty meaningful company still, and much more to be done for sure. It's a pretty small company still, and I think the limited success I have had came from putting myself in a place where I did not feel welcome, or I felt like I was not supposed to be in this place, and oftentimes I was not supposed to be. Like I was clearly not qualified for some of the things I began doing, and then just being in that situation makes you rise to the occasion when you're put in an occasion where you have to be responding to something very hard, and putting yourself purposely in a place where you have to do something quite hard or at the time not possible for you to be doing is quite valuable.
Well, Deniz, this has been fun. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The Bioinformatics CRO provides computational biology services to academics, research institutions, biotechs, and pharmaceutical companies on a flexible hourly basis. Visit our website, bioinformaticscro.com, to learn more.